do with those lessons as we go forward to be effective in the future. That indeed is the mission of SAIS, and so we're delighted. I have one president and several professors, and so this may be the only time that actually someone outranks a professor here at SAIS. But in any event, it's a great pleasure to have a panel today that will be moderated and introduced by Dan Hamilton, but a special welcome to President Aznar, who is doing us the great honor of being a Distinguished Fellow at the Transatlantic Center this year. And then, of course, we have 3 members of our highly distinguished Strategic Studies Group with different backgrounds and bringing very different experiences to looking into these policy questions at SAIS. And that, of course, is Professor McLaughlin, Professor Cohen, and Professor Edelman. So let me, without further ado, get out of the way and let Dan Hamilton take over this program. But again, to all our panelists, thank you so much for helping us to mark the end of such an important weekend.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you all for coming today. We thought we'd take advantage of President Aznar's stay here with us at SAIS, but also to comment on the events of 9/11 and how the world has changed since then, what implications that has not only for the U.S. role in the world, how others see the U.S. And their role in the world. Spain, we should recall, has also been the victim of terrorist attacks and went through also a very major process of coming to terms with that and continues its own battles with terrorism. But our other colleagues on the panel also talking about implications for intelligence, for foreign and defense policy of the United States as well. So I'll ask President Aznar to start us off, and then each of the panelists will try to keep our remarks brief so that we can have a good discussion. Let me start by introducing a colleague at our center, a distinguished fellow at our center, who, as I think people know, was the president of the government of Spain. And I always know whenever he comes, he knows this too, whenever he comes here, after he leaves, I get about 20 emails from people who say, you know, you don't know what you're talking about. He was the prime minister of Spain. He's not the president. And it's maybe a good thing for a SAIS orals quiz, but there's a small protocol issue, which he is, in fact, officially the president of the government of Spain. The function is prime minister, but that is the title, in fact. And so don't send me the emails, please. He has had a long career as a parliamentarian in the Spanish parliament. He was the leader of the Partido Popular, served 2 terms as the president of the government of Spain, and currently heads a think tank in Madrid, the FAIS, and also is on the board of various organizations and companies. He was, when we created our center almost 10 years ago, he was our first speaker at the Center for Transatlantic Relations. When Spain had the presidency of the EU, he met President Bush and then came here and opened our center. So I've always been grateful to him for that. And it's a great gesture to us that he's joined us again, and also now in a more collegial capacity. So we'll be seeing him here as part of the SAIS network. So, President Aznar, it's a delight that you're here. We're so pleased. Please join me in welcoming him, and then we'll go to our panelists.
Thank you very much, Dean Einhorn, and thank you very much also Professor Hamilton and colleagues. For me, it is a very great pleasure to participate in not only in this event, in the normal activities of SAIS in the Johns Hopkins University, and I hope that my presence in this center will be useful for the university, useful for the students, and useful for the ideas that we share. And thank you very much. Dear friends, September 11th is a day to remember. We should not forget what happened 10 years ago in New York and here in DC. Too much horror and pain. I was about to land in Estonia for an official visit when I received the news. I was supposed to meet Mart Laar, Prime Minister of Estonia, in order to prepare the Spanish presidency of the European Union. Needless to say that we both agreed in postponing our meeting, and I was rushed back to Madrid. Let me also say that unfortunately I have a direct experience with terrorism. Friends, members of my party, Spanish citizens have been killed by terrorists. More than 1,000 over the years. I myself a victim of terrorism, a happy one, since I did survive a car bomb in 1995. So I know the anguish, feelings of victims and their families, and my thoughts are always with them. So let me express here and now my deep sympathy towards all the people that were killed on that Black Tuesday 10 years ago. But we should not forget 9/11, not just because of what took place that day, but also for what it meant. In 2 words, the collision between our liberal and open societies and radical Islamists that see us as decadent and perverts that must be brought under the rule of a fundamentalist Islam. Many things has been said and written about why and how the attacks on September 11th happened. I'm going to try even to summarize them. Instead, allow me to flash forward from 2001 to today. As a former friend, Donald Rumsfeld asked in 2003 his commanders, in what has been called the mother of all memos, we can still legitimate ask ourselves, are we winning or losing the global war on terrorism? Because that is the real question to be asked. Are we better off or not today than 10 years ago? I do believe that the only answer is yes. We are better off today, though that doesn't mean that all the risks and threats have evaporated. There are still multiple problems to deal with. The world remains to be a very problematic place, I'm afraid. In any case, from the security point of view, it is clear to me that we are in a better situation today. First, it is obvious that Al-Qaeda is today on the run, has no safe haven. Bin Laden is dead, and his followers has been relentless, decimated. Al-Qaeda's ability to strike is still there, of course, but its capabilities to mount an operation similar to 9/11 are not. Second, the anti-terrorist policy put in place by President Bush has been very successful. Domestically, no attack has taken place in US soil, despite several attempts made by different people. Externally, Al-Qaeda suffered dramatic setbacks, expelled from Afghanistan and defeated in Iraq, thanks to the military intervention and continuous presence in these two countries. Allow me to say, as a parenthesis, that probably the most notable, in my view, achievement by President Obama can be found precisely in the anti-terrorist policy. Because despite his initial hesitation and doubts, he finally prolonged basically what his predecessor, George W. Bush, established. And the continuity in the anti-terrorist policies are fundamental for the success in the counter-terrorist policies. Third, the international cooperation to fight terrorism has improved dramatically since 2001, and rightly so. And it should be even more efficient in the years to come. International anti-terrorist cooperation must be kept not only for operational reasons, also for political ones. Being actively collaborating has established as a mark to belong to the club of serious and reputable nations. Fourth, having said that, I also have to add that the terrorist threat persists under several forms. Even if it is not visible or visible enough. So there is always the risk that the public in general may believe that the threat is gone after a prolonged period free of any attacks. It is logical, but wrong. There are many places still from where to plan and organize a terrorist strike, like Pakistan or Yemen, just to mention two. Fifth, battling Al-Qaeda was a precondition of our success, but equally important proved to be the ideological confrontation. As I said before, there were two visions colliding, and defending the importance of freedom, religious tolerance, open economies, accountable leaders is not only a moral obligation, but a strategic asset as well. Who among us believed 10 years ago that we would be witnessing an Arab Spring like the one we are seeing today from Morocco to Oman? Certainly the changes that started last December in Tunisia are evolving, and not always in a clear or benign direction. And it is too early to tell where they may end. But one thing is clear to me. For us, for the stability of the whole world, what will happen in the greater Middle East from now on, it is of vital importance. If everything goes well, we will have a totally transformed map of the entire region. If not, we will be forced to face a new series of problems emerging from there. No doubt that in order to dissipate some of the uncertainties, it will be very positive to solve once and for all the Libya situation, as well as to face decisively the turmoil in Syria, where the atrocities and the repression of Bashar al-Assad must stop. A attention should be placed to other countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Israel for different reasons. Though all share at least one thing in common nowadays: a growing distrust of America's administration. Saudi Arabia is seeking some strategic independence, as she would prefer a different policy vis-à-vis Iran. Turkey is moving to establish herself as the new player in the region, complicated the relations there. And Israel is confused and overtaken by too many fronts at once, to say the least. Finally, there is a major problem we should not forget about, of being distracted by other issues: the threat of a nuclear Iran, something that seems to be around the corner. The race between the sanctions and the Ayatollah's nuclear ambitions seems to be won by the latter. And according to the inspector from Vienna, Iran will have, by the end of this year, enough low-grade enriched uranium for a few bombs if the Iranians decide to break away from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and start building their nuclear arsenal. That will be in itself a strategic revolution, and a very negative and risky one, I must add. I believe that in facing all the past challenges, the transatlantic cooperation proved to be indispensable. And I do believe it will be equally to face present and future challenges. Unfortunately, we find here two sets of problems. The first one in Europe. Europe is now submerged in a very deep crisis. I hope we will be able to get out of it, but I can only hope. During the last years, Europe has taken too many wrong decisions. For instance, to entangle itself in endless institutional debates that obscure the economic, populations, and social reality. Yes, to accept now that what we did yesterday has little value today. To forget about the commitments made and the respect of the rules previously set. Needless to say that violating the norms has its cost, as we see today. To negate the depth and scope of economic crisis. I have to declare myself a strong partisan in favor of the euro, though unless several and costly measures are taken on time, there is a serious risk that the euro currency, as we know it now, may be unsustainable. If a country cannot fulfill its obligation, it cannot be allowed to drag the rest into a black hole. The implosion of the euro will mean the failure of the whole European project. The risk of a disintegrating European Union will mean that Europe will be part of today's world problems, not part of their solution. There is also a risk that should be averted at all costs, while struggling in getting out of this nightmare. Europe must retain some military capabilities in order to be a partner of America. The Libya intervention has shown the many deficiencies of our military, starting with very inefficient defense expenditures. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, raised the alarm in his farewell speech in NATO. The second major problem for the Atlantic cooperation resides here in Washington. Facing economic problems, the current administration has still a kind of doctrine of leading from behind that to me is alien to the American tradition and probably dangerous in the face of a troubled Europe. This is simply not the time for America to move away from what has always been and should be the clear and indispensable leader of the free world. We both need to overcome our own problems, put our houses in order, but we need to do it so while we maintain and nurture our close cooperation. This is the best way to keep our enemies at bay, and it will be the best way to prevail over all the troubles the future may throw at us. Thank you very much for your attention.
We'll be able to come back to questions and discussion after our panelists speak. I'm pleased to introduce now John McLaughlin, who's a distinguished practitioner-in-residence at the Merrill Center here at SAIS, also a graduate of SAIS, and has had a long career in the intelligence field, in many different capacities, acting chairman of the National Intelligence Council. He founded the school at the CIA about how to train for analytic skills. He was the deputy director for intelligence, the vice chairman of estimates. He was, at the time of September 11th, the agency's deputy director, and in 2004 was the acting director of the CIA, and is now here at SAIS. So, as we said, implications for intelligence and for other fields is part of what we want to discuss today, and I can't think of a better person who's not only been in the field and in the work, but also has time to reflect a bit on it. And John, please join us here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, and I want to join in welcoming President Aznar, someone I met from time to time while I was in office and who always impressed me with his partnership in this great conflict that we are meeting here to discuss today. Well, I've been asked to talk to you a little bit about what this decade has meant for the profession of intelligence in the United States. No question that for intelligence, this decade has been probably the most dramatic period of change and transformation since the height of the Cold War. It's been a time of extraordinary challenge, extraordinary growth, extraordinary responsibility. It's been a time that featured great triumphs and some important shortfalls from which lessons had to be learned. It's really no exaggeration at all to say that it amounts to a new era in American intelligence. The British historian of American intelligence, by the way, I think he's the best historian of American intelligence, oddly, the British scholar Christopher Andrew, writing long before 9/11, divided American intelligence history into three eras. Very briefly, the era of innocence from our 18th century revolution up through World War II, a period of time that until World War II, American intelligence occupied only fleeting attention in the American polity. The era of transformation, from World War II to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, a time when the American intelligence came of age in a global struggle. And finally, the era of uncertainty, that's what he called it, the period from the collapse of the Soviet Union to the attacks of 9/11. It's important to recall what the intelligence community looked like in that last era of uncertainty, before 9/11. Although there was no shortage of concern among intelligence officers about what was going on in the world. This is, after all, the time when we focus intently on bin Laden and form a unit to follow him, time when we were dealing with the Balkan crisis. But despite all this, in the country more broadly, this was a time when the emphasis and the desire was for, understandably, a peace dividend after the rigors and the sacrifices of the Cold War. And so on the eve of 9/11, the intelligence community had just come through a reduction in force of about 23%. Hardly anyone was being hired. At one time in the late 1990s, incredibly enough, there were more FBI special agents in New York City than there were clandestine service officers around the world. Fortunately, the one area of our budget that we managed to preserve and increase in most years in the run-up to 9/11 was counterterrorism, reflecting a very deep conviction stated publicly on many occasions that this was the area where the threat would be most imminent and most serious. And also, fortunately, toward the end of the Clinton administration in the year 2000, they asked us to put together a plan for dismantling and attacking al-Qaeda. As they put it, unconstrained by resources, a kind of blue sky plan. What would you do if you didn't have to worry about resources? I remember faxing that plan back and forth from my basement in December of 2000 on the eve of Christmas. But unfortunately, that administration ran out of time to do anything about it. However, that plan was on the shelf. And when 9/11 hit 9 months later, it came off the shelf. And that was the basis for much of the U.S. response in the early years of this decade. On the day of 9/11, late at night at CIA, I turned to my computer and I typed a single sentence. Nothing will ever be the same. Little did I know how true this was. That first week was filled with dramatic developments that are just etched in my memory. By mid-morning on 9/11, we knew who had done this. One of our counterterrorism specialists had run into our offices and had gained access to one of the airplane manifests and recognized two of the names as being people we associated with al-Qaeda. By mid-afternoon, we were in secure video contact with the president and taking stock of what had occurred. On 9/12, the day after, I was deployed to the well of the House of Representatives to explain to any congressman or senator who wanted to come what we knew and what we were preparing to do. I went back to do this a second day on 9/13, and just at that point, when a congressman asked if the Capitol itself, the Capitol building, was a target, and I had said yes, an alarm went off, and there was a stampede for the door. That's what it was like then. Somewhere in this period, I can't recall when, I flew to Europe to brief our allies and seek their cooperation, which they pledged in great measure. By Saturday, September 15, we were at Camp David with the President and the National Security Team, where CIA put a plan on the table for attacking al-Qaeda in dozens of countries around the world. By Monday, September 17, 6 days after 9/11, we all met with the President in the Cabinet Room, where he gave about a dozen orders, as I recall, one of which was directing to CIA to get into Afghanistan first to prepare the way for the American military. CIA teams hit the ground there 9 days later. It rapidly became evident that this would be an intelligence war. And with that realization, in the Congress and the administration, many changes came. First, resources flowed back. Positions to be filled, systems to be built, agents to be recruited. One result is that in most agencies today, upwards of 50% of the people have been hired since 9/11. One of the youngest workforces in history, but an energetic one, forged in intense times. Many SAIS graduates among them. Second, unprecedented authorities were granted by the administration. Emblematic was the armed Predator drone that CIA and the Air Force had developed in the year 2000. In the last meeting of national security principles before 9/11, in the Situation Room at the White House on September 4th, of course, no one knew what was going to happen 7 days later. There was an extended and inconclusive debate about who would have the trigger on this unprecedented new weapon, the U.S. military or the CIA. When 9/11 occurred, there was no time for debate, and the CIA just went into action. Third, this was also a decade of unprecedented integration between intelligence and the U.S. military. It began in the mountains and valleys of Afghanistan. It was further forged in the battles of Iraq, and it culminated in the takedown of bin Laden in May. This is an extraordinary new capability that our country did not have in this measure a decade ago. Fourth, this is a decade that has given us an intelligence workforce socialized and trained in war. No generation of intelligence officers has experienced anything comparable since the generation that comprised the Office of Strategic Services in World War II, the forerunner of both the Central Intelligence Agency and U.S. Special Operations Forces. We don't yet know what the longer-term implication of that will be. And fifth, despite a dramatic decade of offensive action, there's also been a quieter side that has, in my experience, no modern precedent. I refer here to the deep introspection and self-examination occasioned by the failure to detect the time and target of the 9/11 attackers, despite our strategic awareness that an attack was in the offing and the intelligence community's own warnings to that effect. This occasioned deep introspection. The bin Laden operation, again, reflects and is the culmination of many of the lessons learned from that period of introspection. And finally, this has been a decade of considerable danger. At CIA, a star is carved on the wall every time an officer dies in the line of duty. There are 103. I recently did the math and realized that nearly 1/4 of them have been carved since 9/11.
Thank you, John. Now we'll turn to Eric Edelman, also a distinguished practitioner-in-residence at the Merrill Center. I got to know Eric when he was the executive assistant to then Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot. I was working down the hall, and we engaged a bit. He went on, he had a distinguished career in serving his government, went on to be ambassador to Finland. At the time of 9/11, he was the principal deputy assistant to Vice President Cheney for National Security Affairs, and also then went on again to be ambassador to Turkey, and then switched from embassy life back to the Pentagon, where he was Under Secretary of Defense for Policy in the latter part of the of the 2000s. And now is here at the Merrill Center and is doing a number of other things around town. Eric, it's great to have you here as a colleague, and appreciate you coming forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you for calling attention to the one real distinction I have in my 30-year government career. I'm the only person who worked for Strobe Talbot and Dick Cheney twice.
Right.
I wanted to begin first by saying how honored I feel to be on the same platform with President Aznar. I had the privilege when I was the Vice President's Deputy National Security Advisor to sit in on a couple of President Aznar's meetings with President Bush. And what I heard there was a lot of the same breadth of strategic vision, clarity, and I would say political courage in the face of a lot of the prevailing conventional wisdom then reigning in Europe that you heard today. And I think President Aznar, along with two other world leaders, perhaps I'd add a fourth as well, Tony Blair, Alvaro Uribe, and John Howard, were world leaders who, three of them having fought against terrorism at great length at home, had an instinctive appreciation for the challenge to global order that the attacks on New York and Washington represented on 9/11. And so, Mr. President, thank you for your leadership in that regard. My memories of 9/11 actually begin on the 10th of September 2001. I was about to leave the old executive office building. It was relatively late at night. I thought in those days we were working long hours. Little did I know. And I ran into an old colleague who was working in the NSC staff then, Zal Khalilzad, in the hallway. And Zal and I started to talk to one another about what was the significance of the assassination of Ahmed Shah Massoud, which had just taken place. And we were trying to figure out, what is this all about? And we both had this sense that something was cooking, but we couldn't put our finger on what it was. Zal and I had known each other for many years. We'd begun working together in the mid-'80s during the struggle against the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, when he was on the policy planning staff and I was on the Soviet desk. So we kind of parted ways that night, and the next day the significance of that became all too clear. I was in the office of my then boss, Scooter Libby, the Chief of Staff and National Security Advisor to Vice President Cheney, when his secretary, Jenny Mayfield, came in and told us a plane had hit the World Trade Center. And we asked whether this was a commercial plane or whether it was a general aviation aircraft, and she didn't know. There were no details. We turned on the television, and then when we saw the second plane hit, we both immediately realized that this was not an accident, that this was an act of terrorism. And Scooter went off to join the Vice President. I went down to Dr. Rice's National Security Council staff meeting, which I attended every morning for the Vice President. And that meeting broke up within a minute, and I was dispatched by Steve Hadley, the Deputy National Security Advisor, to go down to the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, the PIOC, also known as the bunker, where the Secret Service had taken the Vice President. And although I was one of the emergency staff who had access to the PIOC, I, of course, had no idea where it was. And it actually took me a few minutes to navigate my way down there, and was stopped several times despite having all the right badges by the Secret Service, and finally made my way down there. And the Vice President, who was in the midst of a phone call with the President, got off, and I explained to him that Steve and Dick Clark thought it was better for him to relocate to another site, one of the alternate government sites for continuity of government operations. And the Vice President said, no, I've got communications established here with the President. If I leave now, it'll take 45 minutes to helicopter somewhere else, and by the time we get commo reestablished, a lot of time will have been lost, and we just don't have time this morning to deal with that. So I started to head back upstairs to pass this message to Steve Hadley, and the Vice President said, where are you going? And I said, well, I'm going to go back and tell Mr. Hadley what you said, sir. And he said, no, stay here. I need you to help me. And so I spent the rest of the day in the PIOC. And we, as John said, we had a video conference with the President, an interagency video conference when he got to Offutt Air Force Base. And I remember the President saying then that we were at war, and that this was going to be a different kind of war. And I think there's a lot of criticism, maybe some of it justified, some not, about the over-militarization of foreign affairs and the response to 9/11. But that day, the President was very clear that although there was going to be a military response, that was not the only response he had in mind, and that this was going to involve all the elements of national power, intelligence, finance, diplomacy, et cetera. And all those instruments have been used to great effect. I think it's important to try and go back and put ourselves back in the mindset of the first few weeks and months after 9/11. If I had had to predict at the time whether we would be sitting here 10 years later and able to say that there had not been a successful attack on the homeland, I don't think I would have said that. I think all of us were very seized, as John suggests, with the sense that we had a responsibility to protect the United States, but a lot of concern about whether we would be able to do so in the days ahead. And we had a lot of events that happened that fall that contributed to it, some of which were known at the time, some not known. The anthrax attacks, of course, the provenance of which at the time we didn't know, which now appear to be an inside job by one of the scientists at Fort Detrick, but at the time we weren't clear on what the source of this attack was. We certainly knew that others, Al-Qaeda and others, had been experimenting with anthrax, but this was a very sophisticated form of anthrax, and that added to it. President Bush, in his recent book, has revealed publicly another incident which was not known until he revealed it, which was that in October, the biochem detectors at the White House registered a false positive for ricin. And a number of us who'd been in the White House that day spent about 24 hours wondering whether we were going to live another 24 hours because of potential exposure. It turned out to be a false positive. And the daily threat matrix, which reported all the threats that the CIA had received overnight, and this is not a criticism of the intelligence community, very understandable that in the wake of 9/11 that people would, in the intelligence community, would report everything that had come across the transom in order to make sure that no stones were left unturned. But it did have the effect of making the White House a particularly terrifying place to go to work every morning, because the White House was one of the potential targets of a lot of the attacks that were reported or being planned, allegedly, in intelligence which we received. So how have we done in all of this, kind of retrospectively looking back? I mean, as President Aznar said, I think the fact that there has not been an attack on CONUS in 10 years is an incredible achievement. It's an achievement that's been purchased at a very, very great price in blood and treasure, and particularly the lives of folks in the U.S. military that have been lost, the intelligence community, as John said, the occasional diplomat. But there have been all sorts of other sacrifices along the way. I think of colleagues like Ryan Crocker, one of my diplomatic colleagues, who's essentially a one-man diplomatic war on terror, who's been successively ambassador in Lebanon, Syria, where his residence was sacked by Assad regime thugs, charge in Afghanistan, ambassador in Pakistan, of course ambassador in Iraq with Dave Petraeus, and now lured out of retirement by President Obama to be ambassador in Afghanistan again. And I think overall, I would judge that we have been relatively successful. Not only is Al-Qaeda on the run, as President Aznar and John have talked about, but state sponsorship of terrorism is in retreat. Saddam Hussein is no longer around to sponsor terrorism as he did before. Afghanistan is not, at this point, a state sponsor of terrorism. Perhaps if the regime in Syria is overturned, that state sponsor of terrorism will no longer be engaged in that activity, and hopefully when Gaddafi is tracked down and you have a new government in Libya, you'll have yet another former state sponsor who will be gone. So I think the record there is a good one. In addition to the threat that the United States faces from Islamist extremism, which I think we've dealt with rather effectively, there are two other major challenges I think that the United States faces in terms of national security. One is the emergence of new nuclear weapon states, and the other, I would say, is the rise of China. On those, I would say our record is more mixed. Certainly, Libya has given up its WMD. Iraq no longer is a WMD threat. The El Kabar nuclear reactor that was being built by North Korea in Syria does not exist anymore. And those are all, I think, positive accomplishments. On the other hand, Iran's nuclear weapons program is proceeding apace. As President Aznar noted, I think we are very likely within a year or two of Iran having sufficient fissile material to produce a nuclear weapon. North Korea has tested nuclear weapons twice and is essentially a de facto nuclear weapon state. So there, the record, I would say, is more mixed. And increasingly, I think the third challenge is one that we have neglected, and perhaps to our peril. Nobody would like to see the United States and China in a conflict with one another. No one would like to see a confrontation in East Asia or in the Western Pacific. But the growth of Chinese military power and its more aggressive stance in the world is something that needs to be taken seriously by Americans. The ability of the United States to operate in the Western Pacific in the face of some of the anti-access and area denial capabilities that China has developed is being called into question. As was noted by the bipartisan independent defense panel that examined the Quadrennial Defense Review last year, on which I served, that was co-chaired by Steve Hadley and former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry. And that undercuts the ability of the United States to perform a function that it has performed since 1945, which is to try and maintain a balance of power in Asia, as well as a balance of power in Europe. And so it's an issue that looms larger now on our screen than it did on 9/11. It's one that we did neglect over the last decade, in part because we were busy with other issues, in part because it was consciously subordinated by the national leadership to those other issues. And it's one to which I think we all collectively have to return now. My view is that the United States, for understandable reasons, is going to have a very low appetite, as will, I think, most of our NATO allies, for any labor-intensive counterinsurgency operations that involve boots on the ground. And you can see some of the result of that in the way the Libya operation was conducted. But I don't think we can afford to fail to institutionalize the learning that has gone on in the U.S. military and the other agencies of the government about counterinsurgency, because you never know what history will impose on you. We did that both in the Department of Defense and the Department of State after Vietnam, and then painfully had to relearn those lessons in Iraq. So I hope that that is something that we don't do this time around, and that we manage to maintain some of the incredible capability for counterinsurgency operations which the U.S. military has developed over the last 5 or 6 years, although I think and certainly hope that they won't be called upon in the days ahead.
So our last speaker before we turn to discussion is Eliot Cohen, well known here at SAIS as the Robert Osgood Professor of Strategic Studies and the founding director of the Merrill Center. He's also taught at Harvard and the Naval War College. He was on the policy planning staff at the Defense Department. He served also on the Defense Policy Advisory Board for the Department of Defense, and served most recently in the Department of State as counselor to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. Author of many works and many publications, but I think best known here among the SAIS student body as Professor Cohen. So.
Thank you. It's truly an honor to be on this panel with three gentlemen who have really had such distinguished careers in public service, serving, I think, not only their own countries, but the broader cause of free peoples everywhere. I also know that this is not a memorial. The time for that was over the weekend. But I'm going to ask your indulgence well, I mentioned two names who are part of the larger SAIS community. Helene de Beer came to SAIS in 1997. She took a course with me, so I knew her. She then, reversing the usual order, went to Bologna for her second year. She was a wonderful, idealistic young woman. She was, had spent several years working for Médecins Sans Frontières. And on June 2nd, 2004, she and 4 other humanitarian workers were ambushed by the Taliban in Badghis province, and all of them were executed. The first associate director of the Strategic Studies Program was Dr. Andrew Bacevich, also Colonel Andrew Bacevich. He himself was a veteran of the Vietnam War. His son was always called Andy. If you saw pictures of Andy in uniform and you saw a picture of his dad in Vietnam, they were the spitting image. Andy tried to join ROTC, was turned down because he had asthma. As the Iraq War rolled on, the Army lowered its recruiting standards. And on May 13th, 2007, he was killed by an IED explosion in Saladin province. So just a moment to think about those two people. Well, unlike President Aznar and John McLaughlin and Eric Edelman, throughout most of this period I was really an observer and a commentator and only an occasional participant. But of course, like anybody who lived through this, particularly here in Washington, I have very vivid memories. I was working at home when my former research assistant called and said, "Turn on the television." I said, "Why?" He said, "Turn it on." I turned it on and I saw the second airplane hit the towers. And as I thought about this panel, all kinds of memories come flooding back. How am I going to help get my wife, who works downtown, back to Silver Spring? I remember being just baffled by the sound of jets flying combat air patrol over Washington, D.C., National Guard checkpoints. A couple of days afterwards, I was serving on the Defense Policy Board, an advisory board to the Secretary of Defense, and going to the Pentagon and seeing the charred corner of that building and the smoke rising from it. And but I have to say, what sticks with me is the smell, even more than the sight of the smoke still coming out of the building. And the giant stained flag, illuminated at night, because the wise decision, I think, was made to rebuild the Pentagon within 1 year. And if you had to reopen a quarry in the middle of Indiana, which was the only place that produced the stone of which the Pentagon was built, they did that. And when they tried to go away from the 24-hour shifts, the round-the-clock shifts, there were 3 8-hour shifts, the workers protested, and so they stuck with a 24-hour-a-day working schedule. And of course, the memory of my own students, quite a few of them, coming in and saying, "I want to talk to you, Dr. Cohen," closing the door and saying, "You know that job I was going to take at Goldman Sachs? I'm going to be doing something else," as many of them have. But as I think about it, I'm struck by really two things. One is just the sheer difficulty of making sense of it all. I spent a good part of last night rereading things that I wrote from over the last decade. And I wrote a fair number of op-eds and those sorts of things. And the difficulty, too, of imagining what it was like, even though I knew many of these people, to be in the kinds of positions that these gentlemen were in. And so as someone who is still a somewhat bewildered observer, in the spirit of a SAIS education, let me lay out what I think are four large questions that we should all try to think about as we make sense of this last decade, and which are often posed, but I think too often answered in a facile way. And it seems to me the job of a SAIS education is to make all of us better at taking these kinds of big questions and answering them in a serious and probing way. So the first question is, was this war? And if so, what kind of war? There were quite a few voices, I think, including Secretary Powell and I think most notably the great English military historian Sir Michael Howard, who made strong cases that we should not think about this as war. We should think about this as crime on a truly horrific scale. I didn't buy that, and I still don't buy it. I think the way to think about it was war because our enemy was not motivated by greed or even simply by sadism or insanity. He was acting with an organized political purpose, as crazy as it may have seemed or still seem to us. But that begged and still begs the question of who the enemy is. And I think one of the mistakes that we've made over the last decade is either to cast this very broadly as a war on terror, which would be a little bit like the United States declaring war on dive bombers after Pearl Harbor, because terror is the tactic, I think, not the enemy, or defining it very, very narrowly as a particular group of people. And as President Aznar has indicated, I think one of our difficulties is the challenge we have in wrestling with and understanding the ideology of our enemy. And I'll just say this, and I'm going to speak now as someone of faith. It's my core belief that all great religions, and I would say all great religions, have within them entirely authentic streams of murderous fanaticism. And that is a truth which largely secular policy elites have a great deal of difficulty coming to terms with. It can be both inconvenient or imprudent, but it's also something they just have trouble wrapping their heads around. Our belief tends to be, you know, those demons were put in a closet sometime in the 17th century. And we're stunned when they leap out at us at the beginning of the 21st. And I do think one of our great challenges is still thinking that one through. The second large question I would pose is, why did the United States react as it did? Some of that, the answer to that, I think, requires that we make those memories vivid, that we remember the smell and the sight, because I think unless you can put yourself into that moment 10 years ago, you cannot understand why all kinds of people made all kinds of decisions. And that is a challenge. If one of the cardinal strategic virtues, I believe, is empathy, trying to imagine what it's like to be the other even when you disagree with them. And I think that is a major challenge for trying to figure out what do you think it would have felt like to be President Bush that day or the day after. But I think you also have to go a little bit more deeply. You have to ask, why did the United States do what it did? And here, of course, the big question, I think, is the Iraq War, which is, in one way, I think it comes about when it does, and in the way it does, very largely conditioned by the atmosphere of 9/11, by changed attitudes towards risk and estimates of risk, but is also part of a separate story, a story that goes back to at least the Iran-Iraq War. And disentangling those threads is a real challenge. We have to ask equally, why did the United States not do what it didn't do? And let me just mention one thing. The United States did not victimize its Muslim population. The only event to which 9/11 can be compared in American history is the Pearl Harbor attack. I mean, in terms of the number of people killed, actually more people were killed in 9/11. Pearl Harbor was pretty far away. It was a military target. This was the heart of New York City, Washington, D.C., and of course, as we all know, it could have been even worse. It could have included the Capitol as well. And yet, certainly nothing remotely like what happened to Japanese Americans during the Second World War. It's worth asking ourselves, well, why didn't that happen? And then I think there are lots of questions to be asked about what it might have done that either it did very late or insufficiently. I think you can ask those kinds of questions, for example, about the way in which we went into Afghanistan, the initial pursuit of Osama bin Laden, and so on. The third big question, again, one I think usually asked and answered in a rather sometimes facile way, is what price has the United States paid? Obviously, we know the price in lives. We can count those, although we can't weigh them. We can count the price in treasure. What about the reputational cost? Because people often talk a lot about that. And here, too, I think a healthy sense of humility is required. It's worthwhile going back and reading some of the global press, not just for the week after 9/11, but for the month or 2 or 3 months after 9/11. And I think you would be stunned at how much of it is, they sort of had it coming. And that's worth thinking about as well. Finally, what are the consequences? And I think some of the previous speakers have always mentioned that. I find it hard to believe that there is no link whatsoever between the Arab Spring and everything else that's happened over this past decade. To be able to figure out what the links are, however, I think you'd have to have the acuity of Alexis de Tocqueville and a kind of knowledge which it's almost impossible for us to have. But I think it's a valid question, and it is an open-ended question. We also have to ask about the consequences in lots of other places, and here I would just point out Pakistan. I mean, if there's one place which I think is in many ways worse off than when this decade began, speaking not just from the point of view of its citizens, although I would say that as well, but from our point of view as well, I would certainly say Pakistan. And as I come out of this decade, if you were to ask me what are the countries that worry me most, Iran is certainly one. Pakistan is very much up there as another. Well, all of us, I think, will think about these issues and reflect, I hope, soberly on the choices that were made and the way in which they were executed. But I just want to conclude with one thought, and it's in line with something I said at the beginning. The thing that has really, this has been a pretty dark decade in many ways. A lot of things that went badly, a lot of things I thought were going to go better than they did. A lot of loss, a lot of sacrifice, a lot of suffering. But I have to say, and I think I was the only one here who was really part of this community all the way through, the thing that was really striking to me is the way in which our students reacted to these events. There was, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, this tremendous shock because it was a generation of students who had really become politically aware during what my former colleague Fuad Ajmi called the Great Picnic of the 1990s. When walls were falling and there were .coms and you could go to find a Starbucks in outer Mongolia and you could travel anywhere, and really things looked so good that the SAIS faculty weren't quite sure that they needed somebody to run a strategic studies program. That's not a joke, that's true. And so that generation of students was initially profoundly disoriented, as I recall. I, of course, had kind of became politically aware when America's cities were burning and Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy were assassinated and the Vietnam War was going on. So the idea that a dark cloud could roll in from the outside and affect my life was not something that surprised me, but it surprised many of them. But the reaction of so many SAIS students in so many different ways was to react to 9/11 by choosing in one way or another, in the public sector, in the private sector, in the military, and non-governmental organizations, to serve and to do something about it. And I think that just says wonderful things about the kinds of people that we attract here.
everyone reflects on where they were that morning, I had just come back to SAIS after being a student here and was going to set up this center, and the school didn't really quite know what to do with me, so they put me in Paul Nitz's office. And so on that morning, and for about the 6 months about that time, I was in Paul Nitz's office, and just reflecting that morning, this office, if you had seen it, it was a unbelievable encapsulation of a different era. That man, whose name adorns the school, personified much of that era, and everything in the room, all of his medals, all of his awards. He had unpublished manuscripts there. It's a great treasure trove for scholars. And I was sitting there just reflecting that was the era that had been, and we are now moving into something very different. So we have some time for questions and discussion. There are mics here, so if you have a point to make, please identify yourself, and if you can, since we have different colleagues here, if it's directed to someone, that would be useful. And we'll go ahead here, over here.
Thank you. My name is Bernard Rajej. I am French entrepreneur, and also I am president of the Transatlantic Committee at the French Business Federation. Thank you for all speakers for being very interesting comments, and thank you to you, Dan, for your invitation. As you remember, the answer to 9/11 has been multiple, has been military, has been intelligence, has been finance by freezing the money in the banks of the Al-Qaeda network members and supporters. And but behind that, there was another objective that has been put ahead by the administration. It was reshaping the Middle East for a more peaceful, less turbulent Middle East. So where are we 10 years after in this area? And as a consequential question, in a few days will be a vote at the United Nations about the possible independent Palestinian state. Either solution, do you think either vote would be a factor of stability, or do you think one way or the other would be really different for the region?
We have someone who'd like to take that on. I'm just... Yeah, Eric.
I'll roll in behind you.
Eliot and I frequently talk about the not apocryphal story that Henry Kissinger tells about one of his early conversations with Zhou Enlai, in which they were talking about the significance of the French Revolution, and Zhou Enlai said, "It's too early to tell." But as Eliot likes to point out, actually Kissinger has admitted that Zhou Enlai was not talking about the revolution in 1789. He was talking about the student revolution in 1969. So 3 years later, 4 years later, wasn't really that odd that he would say it's too early to tell. So I think some of the answer is too early to tell. As I think there are a couple of things worth noting. One, the idea of transforming or changing the region was not completely shared by all elements of the Bush administration. I think that's the first point that has to be noted. So it was not, I think, really in some ways a completely coordinated policy. It is certainly, I think, the case that President Bush felt strongly, as he articulated and as Dr. Rice did, that the exception that we had made of the Middle East for many years with regard to democracy was one that had created a kind of false sense of stability, and it was the absence of democracy that was driving a lot of the instability in the region. And he, I think, found a kind of confirmation for that in the series of Arab Human Development reports that the UNDP started publishing in the summer of 2002. I think actually, famously, his speech to the United Nations in September of 2002 about Iraq was driven by Secretary Powell's admonition that he needed to address this. President Bush's initial instinct actually was to talk about the UNDP's Arab Human Development Report and its finding that the region suffered from a democracy deficit, a gender equality deficit, and an information deficit. So it was not a completely coordinated approach, but I tend to agree with Eliot. I think it's hard to imagine what we've seen in the Arab world if you had not seen some of the other things that transpired in the 2003 to 2005 period, the change in Iraq, the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, and the voting in Afghanistan and Iraq, the meeting of parliament in Iraq, which is televised, which I think actually did have an impact in Iran, for instance, because people saw it there on television. The development of Arab media in general, which has broadcast all of this around the whole region, and the impact that different events in Arab countries have on one another. So I think it's all linked. I don't think it's very easy at this stage to trace all of the lines of influence, but it is, I think, to me anyway, clear that there's a relationship among all these things. On the second part of your question, my own view is that the vote in the United Nations on declaration of statehood, unilateral declaration of statehood for Palestine is an unfortunate distraction from the real set of issues that are out there. The reality is, as Wendy Sherman said in her testimony last week, and as Victoria Nuland confirmed, the State Department spokesperson, that if this resolution comes to the Security Council, the United States is going to veto it, and if it passes in the General Assembly, it will have almost no effect other than to envenom the whole atmosphere around which one would hope talks would be going on. The conflict needs to be settled by the parties themselves sitting down with one another and reaching agreements. They need help from the United States. I agree with that. But I don't think the UN vote in the end of the day is going to change very much or make much of a difference.
I would just, I agree, as is usually the case, with everything that Master Edelman said. I mean, again, just to kind of put a fine point on it, I don't think the Bush administration was looking for stability in the Middle East. I think it understood the kind of stability the Middle East had had in places like Egypt, in places like Iraq, was part of the problem. And I think, in fact, as we step back and you look at where did al-Qaeda and the ideology of al-Qaeda really incubate, it was in the midst of sort of the stable, what we thought of as the stable parts of the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Egypt in particular. And I think that is part of what led up to the Iraq War. I mean, I think my view of the Iraq War is that it was really overdetermined, that there were a whole bunch of things coming together. There was the culmination of the collapse of the inspections regime, together with the also, what people forget now, the collapse of the sanctions regime. It had a lot to do with the behavior of Saddam. It had to do with people's risk calculus. After you had experienced 9/11, people, I think, were just much less risk tolerant than they were before. I think there were some corners of the administration which could not imagine that a terrorist group could pull this off on their own, and so they assumed that there had to be some kind of state sponsorship. Iraq was the obvious candidate, and there were some data which at least made you wonder what the nature of those connections were. So I think there were a bunch of things that came together, but I do think there was a kind of fundamental insight there, and it's important to remind ourselves just what a big break the Bush administration in its first term made with previous orthodoxy about the Middle East. And the previous orthodoxy was this is a part of the world where you just cannot expect people to have any interest in anything that's remotely like our idea of freedom. Now, from there, it's a very long leap to say they have exactly our idea of what freedom is, as opposed to a notion of what justice is, which I think would probably be a better way to think about it. But it was a break, and I think it was a healthy break. And some of what we've seen, not everything, but some of what we've seen in parts of the Arab world, I think validates some of the things that that the administration thought.
I think there's good news and bad news. I mean, the good news is that it's the first time in my memory or my time following the Middle East that we have something occurring spontaneously in the Middle East without any external input that has its focus on universal human values. That's really an historic change. And so that's hopeful. On the other side, as Henry Kissinger said, this is Act One of a three-act play. Hard to tell what happens next, given that there is a near certainty that the high hopes everyone has in that region will be in some way disappointed by Act Two, and then we don't know quite what happens. And then the third point I'd make is that we've had the luxury up till now of, I overstate this, of operating on our interests in the Middle East, primarily in stability and resources. And now our values come into it because they are espousing the values that we have always espoused. And there may be a clash between our interests and their pursuit of their values at some point here, which will require really great diplomacy and skill for us to navigate in a way that ultimately is beneficial to all.
Some brief remarks. First of all, I consider that obviously Middle East, and especially Muslim world, is a more problematic and complicated problem that we have. The evolution, political evolution inside the Muslim world and political evolution in the Middle East is the most important, most difficult political question for leadership in the world today. And it's some demonstration of hope that we have a chance to trying to push forward some countries in favor of more open societies, democratic societies, freedom societies. For the first time in history, based in the decision of the populations that live in these countries, with enormous uncertainties, and with an open process that can go well or no. Second, historically, I consider history is very interesting. Study history, the paradox of the history is very interesting, no? But the freedom agenda established with President Bush was a good idea. The implementation of this idea was most opinable. Except maybe in the consequences, in the most controversial decision, that was the intervention in Iraq. But maybe, for the Arab Spring, one of the most important decisions was the intervention in Iraq. Why? Because a lot of people, millions of people looking, Iraqi people voting, and Iraqi women voting, and act as a democracy with a lot of problems. It is true. But the implementation of this policy was problematic. If you hear the two first speeches devoted to the Muslim world for the current president in Cairo and Istanbul, the orientation, the direction of these speeches, it is very different than the things that happen today in the Middle East. The current president trying to establish a compromise based in the current status quo, not change or establish a continuity of about the freedom agenda. Trying another thing, but the situation is totally the opposite if you read today these speeches. Third, anyway, we have the responsibility to defend the people with some idea of freedom, of democracy in those countries with all the difficulties. And finally, really, I don't support the idea to recognize the Palestinian state in the General Assembly this month. For me, this is a mistake, because all the process between Palestinians and Israelis are based in agreements, in conversations, not in unilateral decisions. Obviously, it's not the end of the world, but it is not irrelevant decisions. If the General Assembly takes this decision produces some consequences. And I am not sure that these consequences will have good consequences for peace and for stability in the Middle East.
Thank you. I'm going to suggest now that we collect a few points and comments and let various panel members respond to a few, but don't feel compelled to respond to all, so we can work on our time here. So right here, yes.
Hello, I'm a student from Rome's University La Sapienza. I would like to thank you for a very interesting presentation. And I would just like to briefly say my story, which really came to mind as I was listening. I'm originally from New York, but I moved to Luxembourg when I was 11. And I remember that when 9/11 happened, there was really a moment of solidarity. And a lot of people really cared about what had happened in America. And then it was interesting for me because I remember a couple years later with the invasion of Iraq that the tides seemed to have changed. And there was actually what I felt a wave of anti-Americanism which happened in that moment. And I remember, for example, being the only student or one of the few students remaining in my classroom because all my other colleagues had gone to protest against the American invasion in Iraq. And so my question is, a couple years have passed since then, and I've had the opportunity now to work with a lot of people from Northern Africa, and I feel, particularly amongst the young generation, that there's still a little bit of anti-Americanism which has remained, particularly from the invasion in Iraq, and this is usually what they mention to me when they speak about America. And so where I agree that since September 11th, there's been a lot of success in eliminating the tools that terrorists use to attack America, my question is, and this is going to, I guess, the whole panel, but particularly to Mr. Edelman, do you think that there are less extremists in the world who want to attack America today or prior to the invasion in Iraq? Thank you.
So please, let's hold these and allow a few other people comment. Okay, right? How about right down here?
Thank you. My name is Robert Kramer. I teach at American University. I'd like to address Professor Cohen's argument about whether the metaphor of war was really the right way for us to frame this challenge. And I'm going to ask former director of CIA, Mr. McLaughlin, what did the CIA people think about that metaphor as, let's say, Vice President Cheney frequently came up to Langley and contested the CIA's ability to discover weapons of mass destruction and so forth. And as the conversation continued, and Dick Clark has come out, very clearly with his reporting that the president personally accosted him the day after 9/11 and said, prove to me that Saddam did this, let's get the evidence right away. I mean, is that war metaphor the right metaphor? Have we paid too much of a price for the wrong metaphor?
There was a question over, I recall, yes, right here.
My question is to President Aznar.
Could you say who you are?
Oh, sorry, I'm
please.
Eliot. I'm from TUSIAD. And I want to ask President Aznar, as someone that has dealt with domestic terrorism, the difference, if you could comment on the differences between the state's reaction to domestic terrorism versus international.
Right. Right here. Yeah.
Jeff Stacy from Dan's Transatlantic Center. I came here just very recently after 3 years at the State Department after spending a career as an academic. And I wanted to ask you briefly, panel, about the future. I mean, it's a very, very sobering set of topics that you've addressed, and you addressed them extremely well. We're all in your debt. But if we think about the future, we obviously, as President Aznar just pointed out, our eyes are on the Arab Spring, are on Northern Africa and these parts of the Middle East. But we, I think, as you mentioned, know very little about the complexity of these societies. I worked for the newest part of the State Department, which is becoming the new Bureau for Conflict Stabilization Operations. This is happening as we speak. And including contingency planning is going on as we speak in case our civilian experts are called into the Libyan operations. But I can tell you from being on the team that essentially engaged our allies for the reason of finding out what they knew about how to transform societies. Because when I arrived, we all realized we didn't know very much. And so I was part of a team that started engaging all our allies. We discovered that they don't know very much, even in the UN and the EU, if I may say. Military tasks, intelligent tasks are very clear. Civilian tasks, how you get a free press, how you get an independent judiciary, are not. So I want to ask you, maybe Dr. Cohen, you could start. What is the answer now? If we have this incredible apparatus, with all this fusion with military and CIA, et cetera, do we keep that in place? Or do you shift some resources, because the pie is shrinking, towards the civilian side so that we can help Libya tackle some of these questions? Or do we keep all this in reserve for when extreme Islamic terrorists strike again? I'm not really sure. I wonder what you think about this.
Okay. Thank you. Charles? Right.
Charles Gatti. I have a question to the panel, but primarily to Professor Cohen, about the domestic political and economic consequences of the last decade. You spoke very eloquently about the foreign international consequences. But what about the domestic effect? What about our finances of the last decade? Certainly compared to where we were 10 years ago, it's a very different picture. What about the apparent growth of extremism in this country and the political oversimplifications that we hear from both left and particularly, I think, in the Republican Party? And finally, about the growth of isolationism. One hears that it's not specific, it is not decided, but the trend, the tendency is, I think, quite disturbing. I wonder if you'd want to comment on the domestic impact of the last 10 years.
Okay, we've had a lot of points. As I said to the panelists, don't feel compelled to answer every one. But I think giving some response would be good, and conscious of the time. So why don't we work back again? Eric, you want to go first, and we'll go down.
Well, just very briefly, anti-Americanism, as Professor Cohen said, is a bit of a complex phenomenon, but I would just make a couple of points. One, there was a lot of it before 9/11 and before Iraq. Foreign Minister Hubert Védrine of France complained about American hyperpower during the Clinton administration, long before any of these other events took place. Second, it was really striking to me that both during the Green Revolution in June of 2009 and during the upheaval in Tahrir Square in January and February of this year, the protesters were not out there saying, we live in a multipolar world, now, and the United States is declining, so what does President Hu Jintao think of what's going on in the election in Iran? What does President Putin think? What does President Lula think? what people were calling for was for President Obama to come out and support the folks in the street who were calling for human rights and freedom and democracy. And I think that speaks to the enduring power of the appeal of the American ideals around the world. A final point is on the question of extremism. While the level of anti-Americanism is measured in the Pew Charitable Trust poll and the German Marshall Fund Transatlantic Trends poll still quite high all around the world, I think you also see a diminution in support in the Muslim world for Al-Qaeda, for terrorism. Some of that is a result of the setbacks that they have suffered. And some of it has to do, I think, with the fact that the Arab Spring is creating a sense of hope among many people in the Muslim world, that the kind of solutions that extremists propose are potentially irrelevant to the real concerns that people have. If I could just address the stabilization in Libya question. I agree with President Aznar that leading from behind is an oxymoron, and that the United States has shirked its responsibilities as a NATO ally in the Libya operation. I think it's particularly unfortunate because I think that has led the operation to last a lot longer than it need have lasted, with a lot more killing of Libyans than was necessary, and the resulting creation of blood feuds and vendettas that are going to complicate the stabilization and reconstruction of Libya. Having said that, I do think that the major burden for the stabilization effort and the assistance to Libya to get itself back in place is something that ought to be largely a European task as part of a kind of transatlantic division of responsibilities, in part because Europe's interests are very directly engaged in Libya, not only because it's the largest recipient of Libyan oil, but because Libya is the single largest entrepot for illegal migration into Europe from sub-Saharan Africa, and therefore it's an important interest of Europe's to make sure the situation is stable and that you have a government capable of controlling its territory there.
Okay. Eliot?
Like I said, there were a number of these which came my way. First, on the question of solidarity, I don't doubt this sincerity of sympathy at the graveside, but that's not a difficult emotion to muster. Okay, and I think it was bound not to last. Again, as Eric has said, there are a lot of sources of anti-Americanism. It goes very deep in a lot of places, and a lot of it has absolutely nothing to do with it. I also think, in terms of understanding specifically extremist forms of Islam, it's important to start within those societies. I mean, if you want to know where the ideology of Al-Qaeda comes from, you're probably better off starting with, what was it that sent Sayyid al-Qutb around the bend in Egypt? And I think the answer was the society that he came from. I don't think it was so much our problem as the problem of the society he was coming from. On the question of war, there are two different issues. There's one issue which is it prudent to call it war? Does that run the risk of leading people to do different things? The other is, and this is the way I approach it as an academic who studies war, is this war? And I think it is war because it's the organized use of violence for a understandable, if to my mind not terribly realistic, political or politico-religious purpose. If it's not a war, the SEALs who shot Osama bin Laden were members of a death squad, not soldiers engaged in combat. On aid, and in my 2 years as counselor of the Department of State, I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan and Iraq, and part of the conclusion I came to is immediate humanitarian aid is a very valuable thing, and we should be prepared to do that. And the truth is we can do that. Often a lot of it's going to have to be delivered by the military because they're the only ones who can deliver a lot of stuff places fast. But I also became convinced that a lot of the aid that we dole out was not really wasted, but in many cases counterproductive. And I think that's actually been particularly true in Afghanistan, where we've created cultures of dependency, where we've really led to a profound misallocation of human resources, so that school teachers who should be teaching kids end up working as translators for NGOs working on dubious aid projects. So I am even more cautious about aid than I used to be. To Charles Scotty's question. On finances, I don't think the financial crisis is because of the last decade. Throughout this whole episode, our defense spending, including the price of those wars, was less than it was for most of the Cold War. I mean, it's now gotten up to something under 5% of GDP. During the Cold War, we were spending at 8 to 10% of GDP. I think there are a whole bunch of reasons why we're in the mess we're in. I just don't think the wars are part of it. Growth of extremism, especially on the Republican side, well, I know plenty of people who are, suffer from Bush derangement syndrome, so there's plenty of hatred to go around. What explains the shrillness of the partisan discourse? And I quite agree. I think there are all kinds of reasons. Personalities. Reagan was hard to hate. Bush was a lot easier to hate. Some of it has to do with the way in which our media have kind of dissolved into these little communities of hatred. So, you can either get all of your news from MSNBC or all of your news from Fox and think that everybody else is crazed. But at the end of the day, when I look at, say, where President Obama is and where, I think most of his Republican opposition is, that they're not crazy, and they actually can work together. They have profound differences of opinion about serious things, and that, I think, is part of our paralysis. And I have to say, I don't see us going down the path of isolationism. I mean, in fact, are the voices somewhat stronger on both ends of the political spectrum? Yes, but they are still quite marginal. I do believe the United States, the American people, still believe the United States has a global role to play. It should play it prudently, but I don't see us retreating into our corner.
John?
I'll be very brief because a lot of these questions are ones that are profound. And we're moving now slowly from one strategic epoch to another, and we haven't arrived. And so we are in a big transitional period now where the answers to some of these questions will become clear, but we can only speculate now. As to whether there are more terrorists created by our policies or more terrorists in the world, which I think is where you were going with your question, obviously not, it's knowable but not known at this point. We can't count. But if we look at some of the data we have, certainly the last Pew surveys I saw indicated that certainly the popularity of al-Qaeda, in other words, the competing cause, has declined pretty dramatically, very dramatically, in most of the countries of concern. I'm sure there is still some amount of anti-Americanism, and I'm sure some people are still drawn to this cause by it. But by and large, if I were trying to estimate now based on the shards of information I have, I would say that the propensity to be drawn to this cause is declining. This is not a good career choice these days for a whole variety of reasons. And it doesn't mean people aren't still disenchanted with the United States, but I'm thinking of it in terms of practical consequence of that. So that said, I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that I would say the problem is over. I could take some time here, I won't, but I could take some time walking you through the 3 reasons why we are still quite vulnerable, even from the part of al-Qaeda that's been decimated to a large degree. People like Saif al-Adil, Abdul al-Masri, these are people with WMD knowledge who are unaccounted for and still on the loose. Bad things could still happen. So that's one. 2, on your question, first I would say most of what you hear about the CIA and Vice President Cheney is largely myth. He did come out and talk to us and ask us a lot of questions, and he was a persistent questioner. He was not easily satisfied. He asked with answers. He kept questioning. My view was that's what policymakers are entitled to do. They're entitled to ask questions. In the end, the positions we took were those of CIA, not driven by his questions or by any pressure that he put on us, and I can document that. And I think there was, mutual respect there. The war metaphor, I don't know. I don't have a view on that. At CIA, our only view was, call it what you want, it can't happen again. and we felt it very personally. Because remember, when we brought the hammer down on these people in Afghanistan and they scattered to, we guessed where they'd go, the settled areas of Pakistan and Yemen, and our bet was right. You couldn't send the 82nd Airborne in there to get them. We had to go. So it was felt very personally at CIA, and I don't know that we ever really, we used the term war, but I'd say a year before 9/11, the CIA director had already written a letter to our troops, to our people, saying we are at war. Because remember, in 2000, we'd had the warship attack the USS Cole. In 1998, we'd had our embassies bombed. We had prevented some attacks, but we'd lost some big ones. So we felt we were at war, and that was the metaphor of choice for us.
President Aznar.
First of all, in general, I repeat it, in my view, a continuity in the anti-terrorist policies that produce good results is extremely important. And this is one of the reasons because I consider that the decision of the current administration, of the current President Obama, to establish a continuity of the Bush policies in anti-terrorist question is a good decision. And it is a good decision for the world and a good decision for this country. No? Second, if I understand, you asked me about domestic terrorism in my country.
Yes, that would.
I fighting always this terrorism during my time in leader the opposition, and my time as president, and currently. I reject all the idea of negotiating with terror. I don't share the position of my government in this question today, because ETA is a defeat terrorist organization. ETA is defeated, but we cannot defeat ETA given possibilities to ETA and to accept some positions established for the terrorists. This is a serious mistake. I cannot accept this policy. I only accept the defeat of terrorists, not pay any price for defeat terrorists. If the price is to accept the presence of the terror groups in the Spanish institutions, I consider this situation a very, very serious mistake. I am against this policy, against this situation, especially because the only possibility for ETA to have some victory is that we, the Spanish democratic state, accept, give reasons or give reasons to this organization. I cannot accept this. Third question, the question in the fighting of terror about the solidarity is fundamental. And let me explain a brief anecdote. After 9/11, one day I received a telephone call from President Bush. And he told me, "My Jose Maria, you must come to visit me, to visit the country." Obviously, we have called President Bush, but I have not special, I don't know, I don't put a special emphasis to visit quickly the country. And I tell him, don't worry for me. Don't worry for me. Wait and see in some months how many friends are you, and then tell me. This is one of the questions. This is, in one moment, the expression of solidarity is total. But in the beginning of the problems, we try to solve problems, the solidarity is more difficult. And find very good friends in terms of problems is most difficult than have friends everywhere in times of emotions. And in this question of the terrorism is very important thinking in this. Anti-Americanism exists. It's not a consequence that some policy, one policy or another policy of American administration. You can share or no. Anti-Americanism exists because this country is the leader of the free world. I defend freedom. This is one of the reasons because exists anti-Americanism. This is the way or the price to pay for the leader, the country leader in the world. And the question today is share a strategical idea, not only values, a strategical idea, and how it's possible to organize better the world in the future, especially in the Middle East. In this moment that this is a very confusing times, but very hopeful times. If you ask me about, for instance, do you know the policy of the European Union in the Middle East? I don't know. There exists a policy of the European Union in the Middle East? I'm not sure. But if you ask me, do you know the policy of the United States in the Middle East today? I'm not sure. For me, I prefer to identify a policy and share or no, but identify a policy. I mean, in this moment, I believe the presence of the alliance, the Atlantic Alliance, the presence of the United States in these regions in the world, I continue to believe that is indispensable.
Thank you. So I have the pleasure of inviting everyone to a delicious wine and cheese reception through the doors here around the corner. But before we do that, please join me in thanking our speakers for a great session. So thank you again for coming.
Dan, I'm going to excuse myself because I got someone waiting for me.
I admire a lot your patience.
My God. You can see why it's lovely stuff.
The photographer wants one picture.
Sure.
Okay.
All right.